Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jo Hargreaves and I'm a Senior Research Program Manager with Wine Australia. Thank you all for joining us for our webinar this afternoon, held in conjunction with Wine Communicators Australia. So today we will be hearing from Professor Roberta Crouch. Roberta is a Professor in Business Management and the Director of the MBA and Master of Business Programs at the College of Business, Government and Law at Flinders University. Roberta's presentation will focus on the findings from a Wine Australia funded research project, The Ties That Bind, building importer and retailer relationships to drive premium wine export sales, with a focus on both the UK and US markets. We will be taking questions both during and at the end of the webinar, but please feel free to send any questions you have through while you think of them during Roberta's presentation. You can access the Q&A button via your webinar toolbar and type your question in. As always, we will be recording this session and we'll provide you with a link to rewatch the presentation later. So that's enough from me, and I will now pass you over to Roberta.
Thanks, Jo, and welcome everybody. And I hope you enjoy the presentation today and take away some value from it. Just a little bit of background to this particular study. It's actually a follow-on to a previous study that I undertook with some colleagues for Wine Australia a few years ago, relating specifically to country of origin effects and how stakeholders, both in trade and consumers, premium wine buyers in particular, what their beliefs were respective to Australia, to Australians, to our wine and other products that we made, but also their perceptions of our competitors also. And I'll be reflecting back on a little bit of those findings as we move through this particular presentation today. But one of the things that came out of that study was that it's going to be really important for our exporters to have the best information possible in order to try and build strong and lasting relationships with our importers, distributors, and retailers. So, you know, the reasons for that are pretty obvious, but I'll just share with you some of what's found in the research and what most of you would know as business people. First of all, having a strong and lasting business relationship takes you beyond just being a transactional trader with a partner. And this does, in the end, give you a form of sustainable competitive advantage. It's going to lower your cost of sales, which helps you achieve higher margins, because obviously repeat sales come at a lower transaction cost. Your partner will and yourself can establish between you a degree of commitment to each other, which is incredibly positive in both a business sense, but also in terms of looking at future relationships with other clients. Your partner will invariably give you positive word of mouth and endorsements, and that's just fantastic. It's the best endorsement you can have. It gives your international brand some exposure that it might not have. One of the things your partner is really good for is to provide you with local market intelligence about competitors, trends, what their customers are asking for, these kinds of things. Partners in business also give you new product ideas, and they will give you valuable feedback that you can use to improve your products and to improve your business methods. So at the end of the day, all of these things make very strong contributions to your competitiveness in that market, helps you learn to move into other markets, and of course, the most important thing, it helps you achieve better profits. So that led to this research, which Wine Australia felt was worth going forward with, so we're very happy about that. And basically, the underpinning questions were related to the fact that there isn't any previous research in terms of key drivers to purchaser choice from a trade perspective or a preferred supplier status perspective from our importers, especially in these two key markets. So along with that, we also have no existing knowledge of their importer priorities. So what's most important to them, what's least important to them, and so forth. There's no understanding of the perceived gaps between what our trade partners actually want and what's provided by us or by anybody else for that matter. And then, of course, key questions such as, how attractive are our wines, particularly premium wines, compared to the wines from other countries? Do they see Australian exporters as good people to do business with? And can we get clues that will give you guys an advantage when you're trying to sell your wine, especially your premium wines, in export markets? So what we did, I led the project, but I certainly didn't work alone on it. I would like to acknowledge now my colleagues, both at ANU University and at the University of South Australia. Key members of the team, research team, were Associate Professors Armando Corsi at UniSA and Associate Professor Vin Liu at ANU. So between us, we came up with this 3-stage study that was conducted over the last couple of years, specifically in the UK and the US, with importers, distributors, and retailers of fine wines. And then to do this gap analysis, we surveyed some Australian wine exporters who were exporting specifically to those markets. The first stage was 35 face-to-face in-depth interviews. And these interviews were amazing in terms of the sorts of depth of detail that we were able to glean from these important trade partners about how they felt about us, how they felt about our wines, and of course, how we stacked up with people who are also trying to sell them wine from all the other countries in the world. This sort of research, business-to-business research, is particularly challenging because it takes a lot of work and time and money in order to screen your prospective respondents to make sure that you get decision makers. So one of the things I'd like to reassure you about is that we actually did that work and spoke to wine buyers, the owners of businesses, the people who actually decided who put the wine on the shelf or who puts the wine, what wine goes in the warehouse. So we followed that up with a quant study in the UK and the US. Across the US, we concentrated on the interviews in San Francisco, Dallas, and New York, but the surveys were conducted across the US. And we ended up with a very robust sample. For consumer surveys, you might think, oh, I would expect to see more than 200 or 253, but I can tell you in business-to-business research, these are considered very good samples. We looked at asking them, what are the key attributes when you stock a wine? And what is the importance of each to that buying decision or that choice decision? And then we went forward and asked them about what they believed were the key drivers and their importance to establishing these long-term exporter-importer relationships to get yourself to what is referred to that preferred producer status. So these are the people that we prefer to deal with above all others. We plan to do business with them in the future. We plan to keep a good proportion of their stock on our shelves or in our warehouse, because that's kind of the holy grail, isn't it? That's where you want to get. And then to complement that, we did our survey of wine exporters in the UK and US. Going back now to what I mentioned before about the previous country of origin study, doing these 35 interviews in the US and the UK was actually the second time that I had personally interviewed these stakeholders in those two countries. So all in all, over the last 5 years, I will have interviewed about 60 people, which is a very good robust sample for qualitative research. And these interviews lasted up to an hour. Sometimes they wanted to talk for longer, and as long as they wanted to talk, I was happy to listen, but at least that amount of time. And I want to say to you that in the qualitative sense, the data was extremely consistent. There's some good aspects to that and some not so good aspects, as we'll see shortly. So what are barriers to success faced by our exporters, just as a starting point? Well, first of all, these two markets, as you would know yourself, are hyper competitive. They're big markets, they're established, mature, they consume a lot of wine, they're very important markets for us. They're very important markets for the French and the Italians and many other countries around the world. And the entire world is trying to sell them wine, and they're working very hard. So from a starting perspective, our exporters are faced with this hyper competition. And it means that you have to work harder, perhaps, than you might have to work in some of our emerging markets to really get some traction there and get stocked by good people. Now, going back to the country of origin study, I just want to if you get a chance to have a look at some of the short summaries from that report, I recommend that you do, because it will give you some insights into how our country image works against us, essentially, for selling premium products of all kinds, but in particular, selling premium wines. So basically, Australia is a country that is associated with many positive things, but not fine products. Australians are liked, people like us, they think we're fun, easygoing, laid back, honest, not stuck up, but sadly not sophisticated either. Words that are never used in association with Australia or Australians or our products mostly is cultured, sophisticated, educated, subtle, complex, passionate, romantic. These descriptors belong to other countries and other wine producers, such as the French and the Italians. We have other descriptors that belong to us, such as exciting, authentic, honest, reliable, innovative, and these are very positive things. But I think it's important for us to realize that we do have this barrier. So because people think that we're a little unsophisticated, they struggle to think that our wines are sophisticated either. So quite often, members of the trade describe our wines as simple. And I'm not saying what they're saying is true, but this is what they think, and they act on their beliefs. So they do acknowledge that some exciting things are being done, but they sort of think we're sort of stuck in a rut with pretty simple wines that are not particularly interesting. So therefore, their customers basically think the same thing. And it's harder for them to get a premium price for our premium wines. It's easier for them to just sell a French or an Italian or an American wine in the US. And the US are pretty ethnocentric, and so they're good supporters of their own wine. And in the last 50 years, 75 years, a lot of new wine regions have sprung up across the US. So we're not just dealing now with Oregon and California, we're dealing with New York State, we're dealing with areas around the Great Lakes. Even Texas thinks it produces wine. So, we have that to contend with. And then of course, Australia is just so far away. And I tell you the truth here, they really struggle with food matching with our wines. They get to a big Shiraz with a steak, and then after that, they're a bit lost. So what is the main reason why a lot of these premium wine importers and retailers don't stock our wines? It's simple. I don't stock it because my customers don't ask for it. Or they might stock one or two, and the rest of their portfolio will be made up of domestic wines or wines from other countries. So just to highlight where we're at, I thought I would share with you, and I've got hundreds of them, and in the report there's more, some quotes about our wine. So here it is. Here's the reflection of our country image. And they, wines of Australia, are Australian. They fit with the Australian personality. They're big and brash and loud. I mean, generally quite nice and friendly, good to spend time with, not very subtle perhaps. For Australians, it's difficult. To give you an idea, we had a second visit from an Australian producer the other day, and they named that brand. And I'm a bit old-fashioned, and the name puts me off a little, but the wines are stunning. So I would just urge you to sort of think about the nature of some of your branding perhaps, and whether or not it might be grounded in our culture, because that may lead you to perhaps be putting things in your branding that are misunderstood or not understood at all. I do feel that the perceptions within the UK of what Australian wine is are still quite confused, and selling mid to premium Australian wine is a challenge. Quite often in the UK, Australian wine was referred to as supermarket wine. If you talked about Australian wine to your average customer, most of them would think, oh yeah, that's great for summer when I'm having a barbecue. That's probably as far as you'd get with a food match. Do you eat any fish there? Believe it or not, biggest island in the world. People ask me all the time, do you eat any fish in Australia? If they're going to fork out 30 quid, it's more likely to be on another country. So here is one of our biggest dilemmas. I have had it reflected to me several times that retailers and importers will say, look, by the time we get to the price for a good Australian wine, people could be buying French or Italian. then at slightly less than that, or even at that same price, you can buy a stunning Chilean wine, or you can get a good Chilean wine for much less. So that sort of leaves our wines, especially in that premium segment, without a position or struggling to find a position. But then there's this. How could you not have a great deal of variety and originality in a country that size? Everywhere seems to have its own streak of originality, and the potential is obvious. It's a question of how you realize that potential. So over to you, I guess. So what we found from this qualitative aspect of our study, we fed into the surveys. First of all, and it was repeated over and over again, the quality of the wine must be excellent and consistently excellent. So these people can buy wine from anywhere. In the UK, they can go to France for a day. Many of the UK trade people have holiday homes in France. They've worked in Italy or France. They travel there all the time. They've got connections. They've got their own pet regions that they love. And it's hard. And they do also have this slight feeling of colonialism. You know, we're the Australian country cousins to a large degree still. In the US, they have access to all those markets too. Plus they have NAFTA, the free trade agreement, which gets wines from South America very cheaply, and they're good supporters of their own wine. The other thing that was said over and over again is, I'm happy with my portfolio. If I'm going to bring in something new, I need to have a gap. If I don't have a gap, I'm not interested. The price has to work. These are buyers' markets. Here's another quote for you. There's no point loving a wine if I can't make a profit. They are very interested in always maintaining good communication and rapport. They've got the world for choice. They're not going to deal with people they don't like or people that they find, you know, offensive or difficult to deal with. And I got lots of comments about, I don't get told when prices are going up. I don't understand when the vintage is happening. Products change, nobody tells me, et cetera, et cetera. So you really need to keep that communication going. And remember always that switching costs for them are pretty much non-existent. They are inundated with offers. Things that were said all the time were versions of this quote, I could taste new wines all day if I had the time. One guy in San Francisco in a beautiful wine store there said to me, I don't even meet people with new wines. I just leave specimen bottles or sample bottles at reception. I tell them to put their wines in that, leave it there, and if I like them, I'll get back to them. So one of the other things that was, and I've left this till last because it's so important, is that you must have an engaging, authentic brand story. And it has to go beyond, we make great wine. Everybody says that, and so that's no competitive advantage. You need to have something to tell them. People said things like, we want to deal with interesting people who have an interesting story to tell us and a great wine to sell us. So it's about the wine first and the story of the wine. Premiums over 12 to 15 pounds. So obviously, particularly at that level, it's quality. Quality tends to go hand in hand with a good story. It's easier to sell the wine if you have a better story to tell the customer. The more I get you interested in the story, the more you want to taste it. And this came out over and over again. Wine retailers would say, I need to be able to represent the brand to the producer. I need to be the producer in their mind, in the minds of my customers. So I need to believe that story myself. And so again, this goes back to the price squeeze, the cost value squeeze. It's difficult to really sell Australian wine on the value. It has to be something beyond that. People have got to love the story, love the wine, love the concept, love the label, all of it. So this is a package that these guys are looking for. So I guess the first takeaway from your point of view is to be ready to export, to be ready to really promote the great wines that you're making. And for that, you need to be sure about who and what you are and make sure that you have those pillars of your brand clearly communicated. And you need to understand and develop, and you might need some professional help with this, to develop your unique story. Why would people want to buy your wine and not one of many others? And it's the wine, of course, but it's also things like what you're doing in your vineyards. What are your vineyard practices? What's the history of why you got into winemaking or your brand? It has to be something that can then be translated very easily and effectively to all of your brand assets. So the bottle, everything about it. The website is so critical, especially for Australian producers, because before anyone will meet with you, they'll be checking out your website, they'll be checking out your social media. And of course, consumers have got their smartphones in their hand or they're on the internet. So they will be looking at your brand assets through your electronic communications, and then they'll be looking at the bottle and they'll be looking for something that really engages them. So moving on from that, we go to this experiment that we conducted. So this experiment is a methodology that's used a lot in marketing research, but also in economics. And what we do is we create scenarios, product scenarios, that are comprised of the attributes that we deem to be important. And then we get people to give us a choice. So we give them a variety of these brand scenarios or wine scenarios, and we say, which one would you prefer to stock? So since you've got to have excellent wine before you're even going to be considered, and they've got to have a gap in their portfolio before they're going to consider you, this was the overriding assumption when people completed this survey, this aspect of the survey. And what we found was that there was two distinct segments in both markets, both the UK and the US, and they are the keepers and the skeptics. And we show you those two in this table that's just to your left. So for the biggest group, we see that the most important thing is the label style, then the brand story, then the shared vision. So over 50% of their choice decision is going to be based around that branding story and this shared vision. And what shared vision means is that the producer is deemed to share the same vision about wine production, about the love of wine, styles of wine, as the importer. And then after that, payment terms, but everybody was pretty happy with payment terms, but they would be because they pretty much dictate them. Whether or not there's a formal contract, if there's any discounts offered, and then number of visits. But you can see that the percentage of importance is considerably lower there than those branding and vision aspects. Now, on the other side, we have a different group. Now, for them, it's about more of the transactional side of things. Payment terms, formal contracts, what kind of discount you're going to give me, and of course, how you're going to communicate. And then the only aspect of branding they're really caring about is the label and the story, not so much, and whether or not they share a vision with you is inconsequential to them, really. So this first group, the keepers, we call them the keepers because they're more desirable probably to work for and to export to, and they're probably going to be more profitable to you. They're 75% of the US sample and 79% of the UK sample. And what they want is they want to share a vision with the producers. So for example, in San Francisco, if I visited a store that sold a lot of biodynamic wines, they want people who are strong believers in that. Maybe it's sustainability, maybe it's a certain kind of varietal, maybe it's a certain kind of style, but they want people who think like they do. They of course want attractive bottles. They can be contemporary, but not quirky or eclectic. And these are labels, and this is important, these are labels that they personally find attractive, because what they do is they attract customers that are like themselves. They want, of course, an engaging and distinctive brand story, one that they can believe in too. 60 days is fine for them. They do like formal contracts, but in any kind of discounts, they would like in the form of free products. So things that they can try, things that they can share with their customers, and they would like to see you 2 or more times a year, if you can manage it. So in a nutshell, they're looking for long-term relationships with soulmates who make wine they love, branding they find attractive, and a story that they find engaging. And then they translate this through to their customers. The second group we call the skeptics, and that'll be, well, it's pretty evident now, but I'll give you some more information on them a little bit later. They are 21% of the UK sample, and they want attractive payment terms. And these attractive payment terms are probably to some degree a proxy for price. Less formal contracts, probably so they can make it even easier to switch. Incentives for their staff, so they're trying to incentivize sales. Quite indifferent to the personally to label style. They prefer elegant or contemporary, but it's not about what they like, it's about what they think will attract their customers. They don't really care after the first sale whether you visit personally or not. So they're looking for long-term relationships, true, too, but they're really driven by changing customer trends, having perhaps a wider variety in their shelves, and they're looking to incentivize staff sales, and they're happy to communicate remotely. So they're expecting the bottle and value to sell the wine. So having established that, we then looked at building this lasting relationship. And so we wanted to find out what our respondents, what these trade people thought was important in terms of moving on with a producer to this preferred producer status, because that's really what you want, this preferred supplier status. And just to show you, of all the people that we surveyed, what proportion of those relationships that they reflected on represented Australian brands. As you can see, 6.4% of those surveyed were reflecting on an Australian relationship. The rest were mostly reflecting on old world producers. So what things contribute? From previous research, we know that relationship flexibility is important, and this was mentioned a lot in the qualitative research too. People from Australia in particular should be willing to accept smaller order sizes, perhaps until they're sure things will sell, for example, but they're looking for responsiveness. They're looking for people who are willing to change things that might need to be changed for mutual benefit. Collective interest, how can we work together to solve problems? They want people that are dedicated to collaborating with them to achieve mutual goals. These are business goals. Trust, of course, which is an active expectation that people will behave honestly, faithfully, and reliably. Cultural congruence. Now, this is different than the shared vision towards wine. This relates to shared norms. So people basically think the way you do. They believe in the same rights and wrongs. And if you have a cultural congruence with someone, you have a natural in-group understanding. The thing that works against this relationship building is distrust. Distrust is different than trust because it is actually an active fear of bad behavior on the part of your business partner. All of these things make a contribution to relationship capital, we call it. Basically, it's the value, it's the total holistic value on a relationship, and then this contributes to being a preferred supplier, which is the goal. So if we look at our keepers group, this large segment, I just want to show you two things that are important. It's not important that you understand the statistics so much, but what you see here is what we call the standardized beta. It's a number between 0 and 1, and the higher the number, the more important it is. That's really all you need to know about that. So of these things that make a contribution, relationship flexibility and collective interest are the most important. Trust, interestingly enough, is not important at all. There was no relationship, but distrust was slightly negative. They all make a strong contribution to the value of the relationship, but here's the important part. The change in conceptual belief, or how much they think of a person or an exporter or producer as a preferred supplier, 53% of that opinion can be attributed to those elements. And the other percentage, to 100, is all the other things that, of course, we didn't collect in this survey. But 53% is very powerful. So again, what are they looking for? But they're looking for relationship flexibility and collective interest. So people who will be flexible, work with them, but most important, work towards common goals. These are business goals. Sorry. But of course, they don't expect their success to be at your expense. These are mutual collective goals. Trust doesn't have an effect per se. However, to some degree, you would say that trust is working a bit through flexibility and collective interest. Some negative influence of distrust, which reduces the value of the relationship. And of course, this is normal. You would expect this. They believe that a producer that shares their values, their personal values, cultural values, well, that's going to be slightly positive. So for the skeptics, interestingly enough, collective interest is the most important. I'm not surprised by that because this would be business goals, relationship flexibility, again, of course. But here's the thing that should be concerning and that you need to be really aware of, because this is still a large proportion of the importers, is that there's a fair degree of distrust. So these people are quite wary. And because of that, they are even more reliant or even prefer more to deal with people who they think share their personal values. So they want people to work together with them. They want them to be flexible. Trust, not so important, not important at all, actually. But the distrust is high. So you need to be aware of that and do everything you can to reassure these people. And cultural similarity is important. Now that's good for Australians because both the UK and the US are strongly culturally congruent with Australia. So this is an advantage that we have over exporters from other countries. So with that in mind, and with that knowledge, we then said, okay, well, let's have a look at what our exporters are thinking. So we basically applied the same instrument and we said, from the choice perspective, what do you think importers are looking for? And we gathered that. And then we asked them to also reflect on a relationship that they had with an importer or retailer distributor in the US or the UK. And we asked them to then give us their opinions about what builds an important relationship, a long-lasting relationship from their perspective. So again, we found that we had two distinct groups. We had a survey of 179, which again is a pretty robust survey. So we found one group, and it's the biggest group, 65% of the sample, that fortunately, and it's a good opportunity, aligns quite well with the keepers. And we called them the brand builders. 90% of brand builders are owners and producers. So they make their own wines and they sell them. And importantly, they're totally devoted to label style, brand story, and shared vision. That's excellent. Strongly invested in trust, collective interest, flexibility, and cultural similarity too. So basically, you know, this is a bit of a match made in heaven. Also looking for soulmates to do business with. Now, the thing that's interesting though, from the Australians' perspective, and I think this says something about our culture, is that we are not distrustful. There was no element of distrust at all, but strong element of trust. So we believe people will do the right thing, and it doesn't really occur to us that much that people wouldn't do the right thing. So the second group, we called the traders because their orientation to selling wine is quite different. 34% of the sample, not really aligned with either of the importer groups, but closer to the skeptics. Interestingly, 25% of these exporters do not produce their own wine. So they've created a brand and they sell it, but they source wine from others. And then they put their wine together, bottle it, export it. They also believe that label style is important, but the problem here is they miss the mark on what importers are looking for. So basically, the labels that they think are attractive are not actually the ones that the importers and retailers think are attractive. So that's a bit of a problem for them. And here's another problem. They have little or no belief in the importance of a brand story and are totally unconcerned with sharing a vision. So they don't have that common ground when they're dealing with importers and retailers. They put, similarly, a lot of weight on payment terms and contracts. Not surprisingly, they're very strongly interested in collective mutual success. They value trust and flexibility. So this group is trusting also. Not interested in cultural congruency at all, so no common ground there. And also not at all distrustful. And remember, our skeptics were quite wary. So just to recap this before we open up for questions, what again are the key triggers to premium wine sales from this research? First of all, the wine quality must be consistently high. Not just good, it has to sing. That's what was just how it was described to me. The wines have to sing to me. So you've got to have good wine to sell. There are two distinct segments with quite different buying priorities, so it's important that you understand who you're dealing with for the best outcomes. You can certainly do good business, get good relationships going, have good profitability with both segments, but they are different, so it's good for you to understand that. And I think you'd probably get a pretty good idea about which segment a person would fall into once you've talked to them for a little bit or asked them what they're looking for. One thing that is a bit of a clue is the skeptics might demand untenable prices or untenable terms. So just be aware that you could be asked to do things that perhaps you don't want to do or can't do. It's just critical that your brand assets and yourself and your staff are professionally presented. This is always going to be valued, and it's absolutely critical for that large group in both the UK and the US. They want to share that with you. You know, these aren't value wines, these aren't supermarket wines. These are wines that they're going to sell at a good price, and they want to believe in them. Attractive labels, critical. It's part of the previous bullet point there. More elegant, contemporary preferred, prestige is also preferred, but they're open to other things. But just a bit of a checkpoint there, just be aware, you know, as I tell my students, the first principle of international business is adaptation. And you need to be aware of what your customers are looking for, what they'll accept, what they find attractive in markets outside of Australia. And while we're culturally congruent, we are not the same. And one of the things that absolutely is grounded in culture is humor. So I think you should just review anything that you do that might reflect Aussie slang or labels that carry hints of sexual innuendo. These are hugely risky. I had a number of importers and retailers in the States in particular question some of the label styles that they're seeing. And the worst part, of course, is that often humor and that sort of branding suggests low price. And there's lots of research on that that will support that. And then, of course, to support the great wines that you're producing and the hard work that you're doing, you need to have your brand assets to be just about perfect. So both from a consumer point of view, but also from a trade point of view. Now, one of the other things that got fed back to me in the qualitative was the importance for some technical information. They want to know about what you're doing, how you're making your wine. So there might be an opportunity for some backstage pages on your website to provide that. In terms of the preferred supplier status, relationships are desirable for everybody, so that's fantastic. In the main, people want to work with like-minded people with common objectives and a philosophy, whether it's towards the wine or whether it's towards profit. Flexible, ongoing communications and visits, particularly for the keepers. And avoiding mistrust is much more valuable than trying to build trust. Trust in itself doesn't help you, but distrust can hurt you. It can really be damaging to the relationship and your preferred supplier status. So just in closing, as you know yourself, these are highly competitive markets, and Australian wine at this point is not highly sought after by premium buyers in either country. You just need to know that up front. However, the majority of exporters are committed to the most desirable wine attributes and approaches to selling their wine, so that's great. The checkpoint is, I guess for everybody, is to just review your branding and review what your electronic media is looking like, your social media, see how that's working for you. There is a degree of mismatch between what our producers deem attractive in terms of branding and labeling and our importer preferences. And this is all detailed in the report. For more information, you can just be referred to that. And again, highly positive that both importers and exporters are fully aligned to the drivers of strong business relationships. And our country image goes for us in this case. Australians are considered to be good business partners. We're trustworthy, honest, and reliable. And that can only work for us. And last thing, just be aware of the distrust factor. And if you aren't already, you need to be a brand builder, because that's what these importers are looking for. Okay.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Roberta. Definitely a lot to think about. And also thank you for presenting the statistics in such a way that for people like me, we can easily understand them.
No problem.
We will open up now for question and answer session. And we have had a few come through. Just a reminder, if you do have any questions, to access the Q&A button via your webinar toolbar and type your question in, and we'll address them now. Fortunately, we do have a bit of time to do that.
Yep.
The first one, and I guess, you know, a perfect segue from your last point about brand, the importance of brand story. A question we have is around the differentiation that might be aimed at physical and emotional needs, particularly in niche markets, is something that seems to be missing amongst the minds of Australian producers. Just wondering if that came up in your study at all, and if you can speak to that.
Sure. I would just again recommend that you have a read of the report that Joe has and will be available shortly, because there's a lot of detail on that sort of thing. But you're right. I think people talk about branding and think that differentiation has to be solely around what's inside the bottle. For many consumers, that's not the case. They're looking for aspects that might relate to the sustainability in the vineyard. They might relate to whether the wine is kosher, for example. It might relate to low alcohol wines that people might be looking for. There's a lot of interest, particularly in California, for low alcohol and sustainable wines, biodynamic wines. And they're also looking for opportunities to, this is consumers, looking for opportunities to engage with brands that might fit with their particular attitudes. Like, for example, just quickly give you an example of a brand called Small Talk Wines that is, I think, from Canada around the Great Lakes. And I use this in class. This is a wine developed by women for women. And it's all about having a long lunch. So this is about having lunch with your girlfriends. That's what this wine is about. It's not too expensive. It's lots of fun. If you go to their cellar door, you can get your hair done, get a manicure. There's childminding. So branding and differentiation can be around your personal values, as long as there's a good wine sitting underneath it. And I think Australians are missing some opportunities there.
Fantastic, thank you.
No problem.
And a great example too. I think it's worth highlighting, you talk about, you know, from the qualitative research, and the last quote that you put up there was around potential. And I think that really is key, and certainly from Wine Australia's perspective, and you know, over the last 12 months or so, our experience in our in-market events in both the UK and US really point to that potential. So I think it's worth mentioning again some of the positive and unique attributes that are associated with Australia.
Yeah, absolutely. We have some descriptors that are ours alone. So, and we need to exploit those because they're really positive. When people think about Australia and Australians, and then that absolutely gets haloed, the term is haloed onto our wines, is authentic, nobody else is authentic, innovative, exciting, and bold. So part of our persona is that we're strong and that we're reliable. You know, I think if you think about some of the history that we share, particularly with the Americans and with the British, we've been together in conflict. You know, we're partners in a stoush, if you like, and they remember that and they respect that. And whilst, okay, perhaps we're not cultured and we can't really play the heritage card outside of Australia because, you know, here's a quote for you. A fellow in St. Louis said one time, well, you know, you can't expect that much of the Australians. They haven't been making wine for very long. So, you know, if you think about that, if you're thinking about how long they've been making wine in other parts of the world, that's true. So we need to play the cards that belong to us. And that's to be innovative, bold, authentic, not to be afraid to try new things, and to be reliable and trustworthy. And there's a lot of things that can be built around that.
Fantastic. Thank you.
You're welcome.
I'll turn now to, I guess, the different groups between keepers and skeptics. One of the things you talk about as being really important is that collective interest.
Yeah.
And particularly for the skeptics, that's big on their agenda. Are you able to unpack that just a little bit more and perhaps give us some examples, I guess, particularly when that is working well?
When people set targets, so when we talk about collective interests, these are business interests because it's a business to business relationship. So you may wish to get a certain degree of sales. You may wish to get a certain degree of profitability. Your collective interest might be in terms of engaging their premium buyers with your product so that they can increase their order sizes and you can increase your sales. So you would together set some targets. They might be sales targets, they might be customer engagement targets that are in the interests of both the buyer and the seller. And you work together to achieve those goals, and then everybody, well, basically makes more money out of it, which is at the end of the day what everybody's trying to do. Right. So it doesn't necessarily mean sales. It could be engagement with customers. It could be branding. It could be to increase the awareness of their store via your wines or events. It could be anything.
Right, thank you.
Okay.
So what would be the quickest and perhaps most convincing way to convert a skeptic to a keeper?
I'm not sure that you can. I think that people have certain business orientations, and now that we have this data, when I think back on the interviews that I did, I can now identify who was a skeptic and who was a keeper, because you'd have some people who would say, oh, look, you know, I've got this fantastic wine from wherever it might be from, and I know the producer, and he comes over every year, and we drink wine, and we meet my customers, and, you know, we're simpatico, right? And then you go into some other wine store, and they go, yep, this is what my customer's after, but you know, if I can't get it at the right price, you can forget it. And they just work through their portfolio, not oriented at all about their own particular interest in wine. And so I don't know if you can shift that, because it's an underlying reason for their business orientation, I think. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
No worries.
It's nice to know at least that there are definitely a lot more keepers than skeptics in the sample.
Yeah, that's true. But however, the skeptics do work hard on long-term relationships too. And I think if you've got the right offer for them, there's no reason why they couldn't work well for you. You just need to be aware of how they operate.
Thank you. I'll turn now to a final question, unless, you know, anybody's got any other burning things they want to ask, please put them in the panel now. But I'm interested to know what, I guess, surprised you the most, excuse me, with respect to the gap analysis. So what's, you know, the perceptions between Australian producers and the importers and distributors?
I guess my colleagues and I were a little bit surprised that there was a group that put so little emphasis on brand story and sort of a shared vision. If you think about what drives any sort of effective relationship, it's almost always based on common ground, on common beliefs. And I think that for those group that we call the traders, they're sort of underestimating perhaps, well, they are underestimating what people are really looking for. So they're not doing as well as they could. They need to go back and think, well, okay, it's not just about what the bottle looks like. There's got to be, the bottle is actually the end of the brand story. It exemplifies the story. But if you don't put any emphasis into that front end, then the bottle is never going to be exciting or authentic. The other thing that was a little bit surprising was the mismatch in terms of what a lot of our producers think is attractive or attractive branding and what the importers want. Again, I just think that perhaps you forget, and it's easy to forget, that people don't always have the same shared understanding, even of something like the English language, as you do yourself. So this is things, you know, these are opportunities for improvement.
Great, thank you. And we've just had a question come through, just clarifying what UK cities that the research was conducted in.
The surveys were conducted from across the UK, and most of the interviews were done in London because that's the hub of the industry there. Although we did do some interviews in Newcastle and in Manchester.
Right, thank you.
Yep.
And I guess just finally, before we do need to wrap up, we talked about the Australian brand and what can be unique to Australian. Are there any messages for the regions around differentiating themselves from that brand, particularly around establishing premium pricing?
Yes, for sure. I have to say that, again, in the discussions with these retailers and importers, distributors, bearing in mind, again, I've done it twice now in the last 5 years, they're really, really keen on some of the lesser known regions. There's some big opportunities for some of the smaller regions doing very interesting things. For example, I went to a wine store, very nice wine store in Tribeca, New York. They carried one wine and it was from Kangaroo Island. And people said to me, oh, you know, and I, you know, with all due respect and apologies to the Barossa and some of the big regions, they kind of feel like they need, well, okay, here's an opportunity. They need to know what you're doing beyond what they think you're doing. So, and for the smaller regions, they're really keen on something new and different, and perhaps regions that are lesser known. So there is good opportunity for terroir. There's good opportunity for alternative varietals, but I think really the terroir, the climate, you know, what makes your region unique, they're very interested to know that.
Fantastic, really important.
Yeah, absolutely.
We will have to leave it there in terms of questions. Thank you to everybody that sent a question in, and many thanks to you, Roberta, for your research and your colleagues and presenting this afternoon.
Pleasure.
I do just want to mention a couple of things from Wine Australia. One is that to make you aware of our current growing wine exports program. This is a series of practical skills development sessions and workshops that we are currently rolling out across the regions nationally. So if you are interested in exporting and haven't been there yet, or you are a novice exporter, or even an experienced exporter that you want to give your export plan a bit of a health check, I encourage you to attend one of our sessions or two-day workshops. You can visit the Wine Australia website for further information and to register in a session near you. We're currently in Canberra today, actually, so probably didn't see very many Canberra industries online, but I encourage you to have a look at this program. It is fantastic. And in addition, if we could just go to the next slide. Thanks, Roberta. Wine Australia is here to help in all of your activities around exporting, from our label integrity program to registering as an exporter and also tapping into the in-market events. Again, I encourage you to visit our website for further information if you haven't already. And I've just included some various links and contacts that you can explore to do that. And that's really it from us. Thank you again, Roberta, for an interesting presentation, and thank you to all of you who have participated in today's webinar. I'll also encourage you to keep your eye out on the Wine Communicators Australia website and their weekly EDM for information on the next webinar, and I believe that's being held on the 27th of November, and that will be their final webinar for 2018. So thank you again, and I'll see you next time.